Imagine moving into your dream home, thinking it's the start of a new chapter. But what if someone or something was already there waiting? The walls breathe with secrets, the floors creak under unseen footsteps, and the shadows, they never stay empty. Tonight, I bring you 3 haunted house stories that will leave you questioning reality. Let's begin with a tale you'll never forget. This first story is The Silent House, submitted by a viewer named Emily, who claims that this chilling tale is 100% real. When Emily and her husband Mark bought their first home, it felt like a dream come true. The house was a beautiful old Victorian-style property on the outskirts of a small town. It was spacious, affordable, and came with a big yard for their dog, Daisy. But from the very first day, something felt off. The previous owners had left in a hurry, leaving behind furniture and even personal belongings. A cracked mirror hung in the hallway, its edges wrapped in ornate silver. When Emily asked the realtor about the house's history, she brushed it off, saying only, "They moved to the city for work. Happens all the time." The first night in the house was uneventful, but Daisy acted strangely. She wouldn't enter the living room and would growl at the hallway mirror. Emily chalked it up to the stress of moving, but by the second night, the oddities started piling up. Emily woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of creaking footsteps. At first, she thought it was Mark walking down the hallway, but when she turned over, she found him sound asleep beside her. Gripping the edge of the blanket, she held her breath, listening. The footsteps grew louder, stopping right outside their bedroom door. Daisy, who usually barked at the slightest noise, whimpered and hid under the bed. Emily's heart raced as the doorknob twisted slowly, but the door didn't open. The next morning, Mark laughed it off, saying the house was old and probably settling. Emily wasn't so sure. Over the next week, things escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own. Lights flickered despite being brand new. One night, Emily came home from work to find all the cabinets in the kitchen wide open, their contents neatly stacked on the floor. She tried to rationalize it, blaming an earthquake or even Daisy, but deep down, she knew it didn't make sense. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Emily was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when she noticed something move in the corner of her eye. She looked up and saw the hallway mirror vibrating slightly. It wasn't a jolt or a crack, just a subtle hum, as though something inside the glass was alive. Suddenly, a faint voice whispered her name. "Emily." She froze, staring at her reflection, which now seemed off. The Emily in the mirror wasn't moving the same way she was. It tilted its head when she didn't, and its eyes were darker, almost hollow. Terrified, she screamed for Mark. When he ran into the room, the mirror shattered. Shards of glass rained down, but the frame remained intact. In the center of the now empty frame, Emily swore she saw the faint outline of a shadowy figure standing completely still. Mark dismissed it as stress, but Emily couldn't sleep that night. The house felt alive, its very walls humming with an energy she couldn't ignore. They called a priest to bless the house, hoping it would bring peace. The priest performed the ritual and left, but as he walked away, he turned back to Emily and said something that chilled her to the bone. "You might have calmed it for now, but this house, it doesn't want you here." Emily and Mark moved out a month later. The house has been empty ever since, its windows staring out like hollow eyes, waiting for its next victims. But that's just the beginning. The next story takes us deep into the Appalachian Mountains, where an abandoned cabin hides a dark and deadly secret. Stay tuned, you don't want to miss it. This second story is The Cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, submitted by a viewer named Greg. A self-proclaimed skeptic, Greg says this chilling experience turned him into a believer. It was supposed to be the ultimate escape, a weekend away from the chaos of the city, a chance to get some fresh air and disconnect from technology. Greg, along with a few friends, booked a weekend cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, deep in the woods where no one could bother them. No cell service, no distractions, just peace and quiet. The cabin itself looked quaint enough, nestled at the foot of a towering ridge. Its wood was weathered but solid, and it had that rustic charm Greg and his friends were looking for, the perfect getaway. But from the moment they arrived, something about the place didn't sit right with Greg. He shrugged off the unease, blaming it on the isolation. The group unloaded their gear and started a fire in the fireplace. There were no other cabins for miles, and the only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the distant howls of coyotes. It felt peaceful for a while. By the time night fell, the only light came from their campfire and the dim glow of the lanterns. They ate, joked, and drank, sharing stories, but the shadows in the trees seemed to move of their own accord. Greg didn't think much of it, chalking it up to the night playing tricks on his eyes. But when they went inside to sleep, things began to change. Greg and his friends took the 2 bedrooms, leaving the living room for the third guest, Aaron, who wasn't bothered by sleeping on the couch. It was a tight fit, but everyone was exhausted from the drive. In the middle of the night, Greg woke up to an unsettling noise, a soft tapping. At first, he thought it was just the wind, the branches tapping against the windows. But it wasn't. The tapping continued, rhythmic, slow, but persistent. He rolled over and glanced at the clock. It was 3:13 a.m. His friends were all fast asleep, but something in the air felt wrong. He sat up and listened carefully. The tapping wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from inside the cabin. Greg's eyes scanned the dark room, heart pounding in his chest. The sound was coming from the closet. With a mix of curiosity and dread, Greg slid out of bed and grabbed the nearest flashlight. He approached the closet cautiously, feeling the air grow heavier with each step. As he reached for the door, the tapping stopped. He froze. With a deep breath, he swung open the closet door, only to find it completely empty. No one was hiding there, no animals, nothing at all. The room was still, too still. But then, in the dim light, Greg noticed something. The back wall of the closet was cracked, as if something or someone had been pushing against it. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Greg backed away from the closet, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. He quickly returned to his bed, trying to dismiss the whole thing as his mind playing tricks on him. But when he closed his eyes, he heard it again, the tapping. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. The sound was now unmistakable, as though something was slowly crawling underneath the cabin, moving closer with each tap. Panic set in. Greg shook his friend Mark awake, whispering urgently in his ear. Mark rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, but when he heard the noise, his eyes snapped open. The 2 men listened in stunned silence as the tapping continued, now louder and faster. Then, it stopped dead silence. Before either of them could react, Aaron let out a blood-curdling scream from the living room. Greg and Mark rushed out of the room, their hearts in their throats, only to find Aaron standing in the middle of the living room, his eyes wide with terror. "I saw it," Aaron gasped, voice trembling. "I saw something under the floor." The 3 of them crouched near the center of the room, staring at the wooden planks below them. The tapping had stopped, but the air felt oppressive, as if something was lurking just beyond their reach. Aaron was nearly hysterical, but he insisted on showing them what he had seen. He pointed to a spot near the fireplace. The wood had shifted, creating a small gap between the floorboards. As Greg and Mark peered closely, they saw what looked like faint handprints, pale and barely visible, pressed against the wood beneath. Greg's stomach twisted. "What the hell?" he muttered. Suddenly, the tapping returned, louder this time, almost frantic. It was coming from directly beneath their feet, right under the spot where Aaron had pointed. It was as though something was desperately trying to claw its way up through the floor. Without a second thought, Greg grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the gap. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, it illuminated something he couldn't quite comprehend. Long, thin fingers, slick and pale, curled around the edge of the floorboards, trying to push them up. The men jumped back, too terrified to move, as the fingers withdrew with an unnatural speed, disappearing into the cracks beneath the floor. Greg whispered, "That's it, we're leaving." Without wasting another second, they packed up their things and bolted out of the cabin, not caring if they left half their gear behind. As they drove down the narrow mountain road, they looked back at the cabin in the distance. The lights inside flickered on and off, as though someone or something was watching them from the windows. To this day, Greg swears that whatever was beneath that cabin is still there, waiting for the next group of unlucky souls to stumble upon it. The mountains are full of stories like this, they say. The thing that crawls under the floor, the thing that taps and waits for you to fall asleep, may still be lurking there in the shadows of the Appalachian wilderness. Now, as we wrap up tonight's terrifying tales, I have one last story for you. It's about an old mansion with a deadly history that still haunts its halls and its inhabitants. This final story is The Mansion on Maple Hill, submitted by a viewer named Rachel. She discovered that moving into an old mansion with a dark history came with far more than she ever bargained for. When Rachel and her husband Chris bought their new home in the sleepy town of Maple Hill, they thought they had found the perfect place to start their family. The mansion was grand, sitting on a hill with sweeping views of the town below. The property was massive, with acres of land, an old oak tree in the front yard, and a beautiful garden that had clearly been neglected for years. The price was far below what they'd expected for such a large home, and it seemed like a dream come true. But what Rachel didn't know, and what Chris had deliberately kept from her, was the dark history that hung over the house like a curse. It was said to be haunted by the spirit of Eliza Worthington, a woman who had once lived there in the 1800s. Legend had it that Eliza had mysteriously disappeared one night, and the family never spoke of her again. Over the years, there were whispers that her ghost still roamed the halls, that she was trapped in the house, her soul unable to rest. Chris had dismissed the rumors when he first heard them. Just local stories, he'd told Rachel. But he couldn't ignore the fact that every previous owner had sold the house after only a few months of living there. There were strange noises, reports of things moving by themselves, and shadows that seemed to move in the corners of the rooms. None of that mattered to Rachel at the time. She was in love with the house and couldn't see beyond its beauty. The first night they spent in the mansion, Rachel couldn't sleep. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, and the silence was unnerving. Chris, who had already drifted off, was completely oblivious. But Rachel lay wide awake, listening to the soft sounds of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing the hallway just outside their bedroom door. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the house settling. But the footsteps grew louder, and then, to her horror, the door handle rattled. She shot up in bed, heart racing. When she opened the door, there was no one there. The hallway was empty. She chalked it up to nerves and tried to fall back asleep. But as the days went on, things began to happen that couldn't be explained away. The old wooden floors creaked under footsteps that no one had made. Doors would swing open and shut on their own, and Rachel would often hear faint whispers just out of earshot. It was as though someone was always watching her. It all came to a head one evening, a week after they moved in. Rachel had been in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Chris was working late at his office. The sun had already set, and the house was bathed in the dim light of a single lamp. As she chopped vegetables, she heard it again. The soft sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor, coming from the hallway. This time, they were followed by a soft knock on the kitchen door. Rachel, thinking it was Chris, opened the door with a smile, but no one was there. She frowned, looking down the long hallway, which was empty. Then, as if to confirm her worst fear, a cold wind blew through the open door, despite all the windows being shut. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The temperature in the kitchen dropped instantly. She shivered and closed the door quickly, her hands shaking. That night, as she tried to sleep, Rachel was woken by a loud bang. She jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and rushed into the hallway. To her horror, the front door was wide open, even though she was certain she had locked it before going to bed. The house was freezing cold, the air thick with an oppressive energy. She could feel the presence of someone in the room with her. She stepped forward, and the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. The wind outside howled as though it were alive. Rachel's pulse quickened as she backed away from the door. That was when she saw it, a figure standing at the top of the staircase. A woman. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and black, her hair hanging limp around her face. She was dressed in a tattered white gown, her skin deathly cold and translucent. Rachel couldn't move, her body frozen with terror. The figure stood there for a moment, staring at her with an expression of pure malice. Then, the woman slowly raised her hand and pointed directly at Rachel. The air around her grew icy, the temperature plummeting further. Rachel's breath turned to mist as she stood there, paralyzed by fear. The woman opened her mouth, but the words that escaped were not human. An inhuman whisper, a language Rachel couldn't understand. It was as though the words were in her mind, burrowing deep into her thoughts, demanding that she leave the house, that she never return. As the figure began to descend the stairs, Rachel stumbled back, tripping over her own feet in her panic. She ran out of the house, not caring about anything else, and slammed the front door behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the car, her hands trembling so much she could barely unlock the door. When Chris came home that night, Rachel was gone. She couldn't bring herself to go back inside. She tried to explain to Chris what had happened, but he dismissed it, thinking it was just a bad dream. He assured her the house was fine, that they just needed time to adjust. But Rachel knew better. The next morning, when they returned to the house to gather their things, they found something that would haunt them forever. In the dust on the kitchen counter, someone had written a single word: leave. Rachel couldn't take it anymore. She insisted they leave the house, but Chris wouldn't listen. Over the next few weeks, the incidents grew more intense. Furniture moved on its own. The air grew heavier, suffocating, and strange sounds echoed through the house at all hours of the day. It wasn't until one night, When Chris came rushing into their room, face pale and eyes wide with fear, that he finally believed Rachel. He had seen Eliza's ghost. She had appeared at the foot of their bed, just as she had been seen for centuries, white as death, with hollow eyes and that same malevolent smile. They left that night, never to return. The mansion on Maple Hill still stands, decaying and abandoned. Local legend says that Eliza's spirit still haunts the halls, waiting for the next unwitting souls to fall into her trap. No one dares go near it anymore. Rachel and Chris sold the house and moved to a new city, far away from the horrors of Maple Hill. But Rachel's nightmare didn't end there. Years later, she still dreams of the woman in the white gown, and she swears she can feel the cold touch of Eliza's fingers on her skin, even now. I hope tonight's stories haven't left you too scared to sleep. But remember, some houses are far from being a home. The spirits that linger within them often don't stay in the past. Thank you for joining me for these true haunted house stories. If you've experienced something similar, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your creepy encounters with us. You might just hear your own story next. Until then, stay safe. And whatever you do, don't let the shadows follow you home.